Seeking Wisdom Week 15, the first and second book of Kings. When you think about any empire in history, what do you think about? Do you think about how every empire in history prospers and then falls and may prosper again? Israel is just like any other great country. It has had its share of ups and downs and went through many changes. This empire prospered, failed, gained, and lost, all while building the nation it has become today. Picking up where the book of Samuel left off, the book of Kings recounts the great events of the reign of King David until King Jehoiachin was released from prison in 562 B.C.E. As we study these books, we will look at the prosperity of the kingdom during the golden age of King Solomon, the son of King David, and Bathsheba, the wife that was stolen from Uriah. We will also look into the dark times of history when the kingdom was divided in two, the southern kingdom of Judah and the northern kingdom of Israel. The tragic collapse of both kings in 721 and 587 BCE, the exile of the Israelites, and the devastation of the city of Jerusalem. The books of Kings are divided into three main parts. Part 1 is the reign of King Solomon. Part 2 is the comparison of north and south kingdoms. And Part 3, the rise of the southern kingdom after the fall of the northern kingdom. So how did the books of Kings come to be? And what is the purpose behind these books? Let's take a closer look. Just like the books of Samuel in the Hebrew version, the books of Kings were just one book. The division into Kings 1 and 2 is due to the Greek translation and separates the stories of King Ahaziah and the story of Elijah. It seems like the majority of this book is based on the chronological order of the kings of Judah and Israel, as told by people that appreciated the royal dynasties. The author seems to be in the midst of the fall of Jerusalem, so speculation points toward the author being a priest that wrote this book around 580 BCE, and it was later modified by prophets and Levites. Although this book covers many historical events, it is not a normal historical work, but rather a theological view of history during the times of the king's rule over Judah and Israel. When we see things through the same glasses as the author, we see their view was mainly the prosperity of the country that depended on the morality and principles of the ruling king. In other words, did the king guide the people of the country according to the law of God? And as long as the Israelites worshiped the Lord of the covenant, they enjoyed peace and prosperity. During these times, the Israelites still cast aside God and ran after pagan gods, especially the Baal, god of the Canaanites, making God send prophets to call the people back to God's covenant. The highest point of success of Israel marked during the reign of King Solomon is recorded in the first book of Kings in chapters 1 to 11. These chapters sing the praises of the third king of Israel with all his glory, wealth, and wisdom. This was a king like no other. There was no greater king before or after him. King Solomon became known as the greatest king of Israel, with his most important task being to build the Temple of Jerusalem, the political and religious center of Israel. King Solomon was also known as a very wise king. Wise meaning the necessary qualities God bestows upon the king, not the moral essentiality of today's understanding. During his reign, King Solomon reached the peak of glory in the contemporary view of Israel. King David deeply desired a temple to honor God to be built, but this desire was only fulfilled during the reign of King Solomon. During the 4th year of his reign, King Solomon started the construction of the temple and completed the building 7 years later. Upon completion, the Ark of the Lord was sent into the temple, but as we know, God does not depend on a building. He is always present for the love of his people. And when people are no longer faithful, even the temple's presence is not necessary. The book of Kings comes to a tragic end when the temple is destroyed and the people of Israel are taken into exile. The Lord himself warned Solomon earlier, "If you turn aside from following me, you or your children, and do not keep my commandments and my statutes that I have set before you, but go and serve other gods and worship them. The kingdom of Israel went through a very degenerative era when the kingdom became divided in two. From chapter 12 of Book 1 to chapter 17 of Book 2, there was a political and religious crisis that gripped God's people. The continuous wars among themselves declined during the time of King Ahab, who brought a period of peace and an end to the reign of Josiah. The next time period was a time of peace interwoven with a time of war, until the year 721. At this time, the kingdom of Israel was defeated by the Assyria army, and the people were exiled, leaving Judah to live in a state of dominion. The author explains that the people and kings of Israel saw the fall of their kingdom because they were overcome in sin, worshiping pagan gods and disloyalty to God and his commandments. After a political upheaval, Jehoram became the next king of all Israel, and the tribe of Judah was the only tribe to follow the house of David. Jehoram decided to place 2 golden calves in Bethel and Dan in an attempt to keep people from going to Jerusalem to worship. Jehoram, not wanting people to turn against him, used religion as a tool to gain political clout. God was no longer the one to be worshipped, but became the means to serving cunning humans wanting more power. Of course, God did not accept this. In these books, the prophets are always present at the focal point of the history of the holy people. At the beginning of Book 1, the prophet Nathan intervenes at the side of King David to give King Solomon the throne, which turns out to be a special turning point in the history of the country and religion. Then the prophets Elijah and Elisha appear at the time that the faith in Israel was almost gone because of the queen. The prophets, God's messengers, who speak the word of God to the kings and people, warn them to walk righteously to avoid the wrath of God. The prophet Elijah's name, meaning Yahweh is my God, ministered under the kings Ahab, Ahaziah, and Jehoram. These kings often worshipped God, but also followed the pagan gods, Baal and Asherah, praying for rain. Queen Jezebel, an evil woman who promoted the worship of pagan gods, proved to be difficult when Elijah had to deal with her. Many prophets also worshiped pagan gods, but Elijah was insistent on full and pure faith in Yahweh. Elisha, the disciple of the prophet Elijah, responded to God's invitation by slaughtering oxen, boiling their flesh, and feeding people. This resolute action expresses his determination to give up everything to follow the master Elijah. After becoming a prophet, Elisha performed many miracles, including cleansing the drinking water of Jericho, increasing the amount of oil the widow had to pay her debt, and healing people of many sicknesses and diseases. The emphasis is on the power of the Word of God, the Word of healing, and the Word of life is expressed in detail through the healing of Naaman's leprosy, who was an army commander of Aram. The end of the book of Kings brings forth a hope for God's people. And the promise for the house of David to exist is still very much alive. Because even when the kingdom of Israel is in exile, the king of Babylon still treats King Judah compassionately, and eventually Jehoiachin is released. The inspirational light at the end of the tunnel is seen and opens a door of hope for a nation in exile. The lamp always burning in Jerusalem that God promised to the house of David still has hope. The book of Kings closes with grace bestowed upon King Jehoiachin as the dawn of redemption. The lessons learned in the book of Kings need to be used in our everyday life. When King Solomon was anointed as king in 970 B.C.E., he said a prayer for wisdom. He prayed to God, "Give your servant, therefore, an understanding mind to govern your people, able to discern between good and evil, for who can govern this, your great people?" His plea was pleasing to God, and he gave him the wisdom that made him famously wise and regarded as a model of wisdom in Israel's history. Solomon's request came from a humble soul, aware that it would not be possible to fulfill the great responsibility entrusted without God's grace. That prayer shows us the importance of listening to the Lord and listening to the voice of the people. Because if nobody listens, who hears what is being said? Who will recognize the truth? Who will help the person in need? Who will answer the wishes of the people of God? Unfortunately, Solomon was not always faithful to his original will and didn't always listen to the Lord's voice or hear the cry of God's people. Solomon at one point became increasingly inclined to the lifestyle of the Gentiles, building temples for his pagan wives, among other things. This allowed the Israelites' sins to eventually bring the country into a state of devastation. Reading the books of Kings, we notice an all too familiar pattern. When the people of Israel are unsuccessful and struggling, they cling to God. And when they have found success and happiness, they desert God and turn away from Him. This is also similar to what happens today in many of our lives. When we have found happiness and success, we turn away from God. And the second that our lives take a turn for the worst, we call on God to help us through the tough times. When people turn away from God, they often follow some other idol, such as money or gambling, etc. And instead of inciting goodness into the world to protect it, we fall into the temptations of evil and lose our Christian identity. Elijah's suffering compares very closely to Moses' life, when Moses was so miserable that he asked God to just let him die. Elijah also feels that death would put an end to his misery and asks God to let him die. But Elijah so loved the Lord that he faced the threat of the queen Jezebel, eventually leaving so he was not killed. While he was on the run and very tired, he lamented to the Lord, "It is enough now. O Lord, take away my life, for I'm no better than my ancestors." This is also the mindset of Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane, and each one of us when we are depressed and frustrated, sometimes finding ourselves not knowing how to deal with injustice and loss. But remember Paul's words, "No testing has overtaken you that is not common to everyone. God is faithful, and He will not let you be tested beyond your strength. But with the testing, He will also provide the way out so that you may be able to endure it." Let's conclude this week's lesson with a story about Solomon's wisdom and judgment. Later, 2 women who were prostitutes came to the king and stood before him. The one woman said, "Please, my lord, this woman and I live in the same house, and I gave birth while she was in the house. Then on the 3rd day after I gave birth, this woman also gave birth. We were together. There was no one else with us in the house. Only the 2 of us were in the house. Then this woman's son died in the night because she lay on him. She got up in the middle of the night and took my son from beside me while your servant slept. She laid him at her breast and laid her dead son at my breast. When I rose in the morning to nurse my son, I saw that he was dead. But when I looked at him closely in the morning, clearly it was not the son I had born." But the other woman said, "No, the living son is mine, and the dead son is yours." The first said, "No, the dead son is yours, and the living son is mine." So they argued before the king. Then the king said, "The one says, 'This is my son that is alive, and your son is dead,' while the other says, 'Not so. Your son is dead, and my son is a living one.' So the king said, 'Bring me a sword.' And they brought a sword before the king. The king said, 'Divide the living boy in 2, then give half to the one and half to the other.' But the woman whose son was alive said to the king, because compassion for her son burned within her, 'Please, my lord, give her the living boy. Certainly do not kill him.' The others said, 'It shall be neither mine nor yours. Divide it.' Then the king responded, 'Give the first woman the living boy. Do not kill him. She is his mother.' All Israel heard of the judgment that the king had rendered, and they stood in awe of the king, because they perceived that the wisdom of God was in him to execute justice. Thank you for watching. We hope you enjoyed this week's lesson. Please join us next Friday for our new video. The answer to this week's questions will be revealed in next week's video. Remember, every Friday at 7 p.m., the Seeking Wisdom Challenge will be posted on YouTube and Facebook. If you enjoyed this video, please like, share, or subscribe to our channel. If you have any questions, leave them in the comment section below. Thank you for watching, and we wish you a wonderful weekend full of grace and joy.